And now for the reason you're all here today, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Weingarten. And I'm gonna read her bio here because it's pretty fabulous. And we need to honor everything that she has accomplished here. So Elizabeth Weingarten is a journalist and applied behavioral scientist who spends her career at the intersection of science and storytelling. A graduate of Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, she has worked on the editorial staffs of The Atlantic, Slate, and Qatar Today, and was managing editor of Behavioral Scientist. Her writing is regularly appearing in The Atlantic, Slate, CNN, and Financial Times, Quartz, Harvard Business Review, and Time, and she has led research programs at the think tank New America and the consultancy Ideas 42, and the tech companies Torch and Udemy, and is currently principal for thought leadership strategy at Okta. So in Elizabeth's new book, which came out earlier this year, How to Fall in Love with Questions, A New Way to Thrive in Times of Uncertainty, she draws on Rainer Maria Rilke's century-old encouragement to live the questions and pairs it with contemporary behavioral science to offer readers a fresh way to work with life's biggest uncertainties. As an in-demand speaker, Elizabeth has shared her work and led workshops at venues including South by Southwest, the United Nations, International Monetary Fund, University of Pennsylvania, Stanford University, and the University of Virginia. She currently lives in Northern California with her husband and son, bringing the same curiosity that shapes her writing to how she engages with every audience she speaks to. So thank you all for being here today. I am so excited to hand this over to Elizabeth.
Awesome. Claire, thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be with you all today. Let me just share my screen here. All right, I think we are good. All right. So as we get started here, we're going to be bouncing around lots of different subjects. This might be a little bit less traditional than some of the talks that you've been to, because we're going to be talking about poetry and history and behavioral science, of course. But I first want to really ground us in some of the key takeaways of this conversation so you know what you're going to be learning about. So we're first going to learn a little bit about the biology of why uncertainty can be so hard for us to tolerate, which is rooted in how our brains are wired and how we were evolved. Um, we're next going to learn why this tendency that we have to prefer certainty over uncertainty can actually hamper good decision making and solution finding in both our personal lives and our professional lives. And finally, we're going to learn about another strategy to relate to uncertainty. I should say, too, something that might be a little bit different about this presentation is I'm going to talk both about personal examples, my own personal examples, and maybe you'll have a chance to share some of yours, and also professional throughout our conversation today. And that is all intentional. We often artificially separate or kind of bifurcate our personal and professional lives. But when it comes to being able to tolerate uncertainty and to form this different relationship with it, which I think is something everybody wants to do, um, the how you do it in your personal life is deeply connected to how you do it at work. And a big part of what I share in my book, which I'll talk about in a moment, are stories of people whose personal and professional lives have really blended together, who found that they couldn't address their ability to tolerate uncertainty, these big questions, in one sphere of life without addressing it in the other. All right, so with all of that said, let's dive in. My book is all about how we can get unstuck from this experience of uncertainty. How do we use it to propel us forward rather than keeping us stuck by changing our relationship to life's biggest questions? And it emerged during a time in my life when I personally was buckling under very heavy questions about my relationship and my career. So I had recently left a job to pursue a creative project that was not working out. And I was also in a marriage that really felt like it was failing. And the advice that I found again and again in self help and pop psychology books was to just, quote, embrace uncertainty. And I'm curious, you can say in the chat if you've ever heard this advice before, just embrace uncertainty. Um, I was asking questions like, should I get a divorce? And what am I doing with my life? And to me, in that context, embrace uncertainty just felt like this really unhelpful platitude. I didn't want to embrace uncertainty. I just, it was terrible. I just wanted to know exactly what to do. And perhaps you felt this way at different moments in your personal life. Maybe you felt this in your professional life. But luckily, it was around that time that I discovered a much older book that contained what for me was much better, if not more challenging advice. So this book was Letters to a Young Poet. And I'm going to try to look at the chat. Yes, I agree. That advice is about as useful as just do it. I'm curious if any of you have read Letters to a Young Poet. So feel free to share in the chat if this is familiar to you at all. But if you haven't, it's a book of correspondence between the Austrian poet Rainier Maria Rilke and a 19-year-old aspiring poet who was named Franz Capus from the early 20th century. And it's a book that counts people like Lady Gaga, Dustin Hoffman, Marilyn Monroe among its fans. And Lady Gaga even has a line from it tattooed on her. The whole book is beautiful, but I was really struck by one part of it. And this is a part where Kappas is asking Rilke for all kinds of advice, not only about how to become a poet, but also about how to live his life. And Rilke very famously responds to quote, be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers which cannot be given to you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. So this was a beautiful passage, I believe. But Rilke, in Letters to a Young Poet, never explained what he meant really by living the questions now or how to think about loving the questions practically. He also wasn't thinking about how to do this in a time of AI, Google, smartphones, social media influencers, answers all around us, right? And he wasn't thinking about how to do this, of course, in the context of product development, where ambiguity tolerance is really essential. If you feel anxious about a deadline, about some uncertainty, shifting market, and you build the first solution that comes to mind, you might end up building the wrong thing, right? So there are all these ways in which being able to live the question, to tolerate that uncertainty and ambiguity is important. So this book is really an exploration of how do we fall in love with the questions of our lives? What does this mean practically, especially the ones that can be painful, and especially in a culture in which so many of us have become addicted to fast, easy answers? So I think this passage has endured more than 100 years because Rilke understood something that was really profound. And that is when we obsess over finding answers and solutions immediately rather than sitting with and exploring our questions, we can miss out on opportunities to learn, to grow, to expand, and even to find the best solutions. We miss out on opportunities to let the world and other people surprise us. And really fundamentally, we miss out on our life. So I'm excited today to share another way to exist in the unknown. And I hope for you that it will be a strategy that will help you convert your questions from tormentors to teachers and from anchors into engines. So to start, let's start to kind of peel back the layers of what that passage means and how it might actually apply to our lives today. Loving the questions is really another way of encouraging somebody to change their relationship to uncertainty. But what is uncertainty? My favorite definition is that it's a sense of doubt that blocks or delays action. And this is from a paper written by two psychologists who were exploring how decision makers conceptualize and cope with ambiguity. And I really like this definition because it gets at the physical experience of uncertainty, which is it often does make us feel stuck, like we can't move forward in our lives until and unless we have all of the answers. So I'm curious if you want to share just what does uncertainty feel like to all of you? Um, you know, feel free to just share a word, an experience, but I'm curious if there's like one word that comes to mind when you think about uncertainty. Bracing. Mm-hmm. Murky, yeah, for sure. Any other words that come to mind? Anxiety, absolutely. Procrastination, comfortable. Yeah, shut it down. Yeah, yeah. Optimistic terror, uneasy, kaleidoscope. Oh, these are so interesting. Panic, run, scary. Yes. I think these are all exciting. I like, you know what? Everybody has a different reaction. Paralyzing, absolutely. These are all very, very normal, and I have also felt all of those before. So, through my reporting, I've come to define loving and living the questions as really a strategy to break through the paralysis of uncertainty. And I know somebody put paralyzing in there. Um, and it's a way of seeking the truth that's less interested in the final answer or outcome and more about what you can learn along the way. And fundamentally, it's a strategy that allows you to move forward in your life, personal and professional, and to regain agency and momentum, even when you don't have all of the answers. It's also a way of channeling your inner Ariana Grande. So if anybody remembers the song "Break Free," that is her right there. Um, Importantly, it's also a more expansive way of relating to the questions in our lives. And I say that because you should know that for Rilke, love and this idea of loving the questions was anything but some kind of squishy, meaningless platitude. So if you're thinking about embrace uncertainty, okay, how is loving the questions different? Well, Rilke describes in other letters, he describes the act of love as the most difficult task we take on as humans, the most difficult task and the most rewarding, of course. And this might ring true for you too, if you think about what it's like to love another person. It's often not easy, but it is generally worth the sacrifice and the challenge. But loving the questions, similarly, one of the most challenging things we can do, and potentially one of the most rewarding. So, that said, as you have all described, loving the questions, and particularly these big questions that we might have about meaning and relationships, love and loss, that can feel really, really awful. You can feel fearful, anxious, afraid, all these things. So the question is, why does uncertainty make us feel stuck and often so anxious in those moments? According to selfish brain theory, part of the reason is because navigating uncertainty takes up more metabolic energy. And because our brains are wired for times when food was scarcer, they still to this day want to conserve energy and seek certainty, seek that, easier path whenever possible. So as a result, we code uncertainty as being aversive because at the end of the day, we know that it's going to take us more energy to be able to navigate. So what we also find is that as a result of feeling this aversion, this anxiety and uncertainty, research suggests that most of us would do almost anything to avoid uncertainty, even accepting greater risk or certain pain. And psychologists call our tendency to want to resolve this uncertainty the need for closure. And I think somebody put that in the comments too, the need for closure. Um, this also can show up as action bias or that impulse to just do something rather than exploring multiple solutions, and even premature optimization, where you might settle on an architecture before you actually take the time to understand user behavior. So having a high need for closure can be a problem, especially when you're trying to make a really good decision at work. When we're faced with problems, we're often under pressure to generate really immediate solutions. And I'm sure folks have been in that situation before. I know that I have been at work, and it's tempting to get a quick answer. Maybe it's from a colleague, or maybe it's even from AI, right? And just to feel relieved that you don't have to sit with that question for any longer. You figured it out. But for big, important questions, it means that you're skipping a few steps and possibly missing out on the full range of possible answers and solutions that you could draw from. So you're not first asking, in this case, if you're even asking the right question, right, in the first place. You're asking from a place of fear rather than curiosity. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how to kind of reverse that. So it may not be surprising that one way to address those negative feelings that come up during uncertainty and that tendency that we have to want to resolve it immediately is through cultivating curiosity and developing a deeper relationship to our questions. So you can think about this research as kind of substantiating Rilke's poetic remarks. So there was a 10-year Harvard and Penn State study on thousands of adults that found that the more you naturally enjoy deep thought and curiosity, what they call in this study the need for cognition, the fewer symptoms of anxiety and depression you tend to have. So essentially, if you're training your mind to anchor in questions instead of getting kind of wedded to a particular thought about the future, that can act as a protective shield against distress. And this is something that one of the lead study authors talked to me about for my book. Today, we're going to talk about the tools and mindsets that can help us change the relationships that we have to our question, or change the relationship that we have to our questions, particularly the ones that can feel really challenging to carry. And I will say in this next section, we're going to have a couple of moments where you will get to practice yourself too. So the first step to developing a different relationship to your question or questions is understanding what kind of question you're asking. The question of what are we having for dinner tonight is very different from the question of like, who am I, right? And so I put together a framework based on the anatomy of a fruit tree to help you kind of understand and get a little bit of clarity on what type of question you're asking and what expectations you should have for that question. So the first type of question here is a peach question, and this is like a short-term answerable question. So you can think of this as just like peaches ripen pretty quickly. You can also get answers to these questions on a shorter timeline. So an example might be, will I get the job? Or will this A/B test clear our significance threshold? A pawpaw question. This is the second type of question. And this is a question that you can still get an answer to, but it's a longer term question. And it's called a pawpaw because I learned that it takes a pawpaw tree 5 to 7 years to grow ripened fruit. So these are the types of questions that will just take a little bit of a longer time to answer. So whether or how you might stay in a relationship, if you'll feel a greater sense of meaning from a career change, or maybe it's if a pivot into a new market will succeed. The third type of question is a heartwood question. These are the questions that are never really permanently answerable, but they're the questions that stay with you across your life. Heartwood is the inner wood of the tree, and its purpose is to help with balance, stability, and security. And so similarly, these are the heartwood questions that really can kind of help you maintain that balance and stability across your life, helping you come back to your core and a sense of equilibrium. So examples of these questions might be, who am I? How do I live a life of meaning and purpose? How do I build a career that balances high performance and well-being? And the final type of question is a dead leaf. And these are the questions that don't ripen into answers, we don't want to carry with us, and the questions that ultimately we'd be better off just releasing. These are often questions about past decisions that drive rumination and suffering. So examples could be, why did we break up? What if I had done it differently? Maybe it's about why, what if we hadn't deprecated that legacy feature, right? If a question isn't helping you grow and move forward, it might be time to let it go. So right now, we're just going to take 2 minutes to write down, at least one question that's on your mind. And we will use this in one more exercise today. So just encourage you to, again, just take 2 minutes, and I'll call us back in 2 minutes. Oh, and I will say too, here are some question inspiration if you need it. Yeah, and thanks for sharing these questions. Will it be good enough? Do I have what it takes to forge a path for a media brand? So I'll put the question categories back up too, but hopefully this is two. We'll take maybe one more minute. How can I learn from past relationships? Yeah. Yeah, the past was good. Oh, the business crash. Yeah. Do people want to hear what I have to say? And it is what I have to share worth people's time? Yeah, these are great. These are great questions. Okay, we're gonna come back together and feel free to keep sharing your questions in the chat. Really appreciate you sharing them. Um, I think the question now is, okay, what do we do with these questions now that we have them? And this is where the questions map and practice comes into play. And I'm going to share a little bit about this. I go into detail in the book all about the questions practice and the map. But you can think of a questions practice like a yoga practice or piano practice or even a regular practice of hiking or walking in nature. And it's really a time to explore and commit to the questions that are guiding your life. And this practice, fundamentally, it's not just about getting answers, it's about finding clarity in uncertainty so that you can still move forward even when you don't have the answers. So I found that there are four essential elements in a questions practice. So one is curiosity. When you relate to the uncertainty in your life with more curiosity than fear, you ask questions of your experience that open you up to new possibilities, solutions, and ideas. The second piece of this is conversation. Questions are parts of conversations that we have with ourselves and others. And these conversations, if we allow them to, can guide us through uncertainty. In the book, I share lots of different practices and ideas to help you have better conversations with yourself during times of uncertainty. The third piece of this is community. Modern neuroscience shows us that a sense of being connected in community not only reduces stress inducing cortisol, but also activates the parts of our brain that indicate we're getting a reward and we're safe. So, the right kind of supportive community can put us in an optimal state of mind to explore questions rather than rushing towards answers. And then finally, commitment. And we need to commit to the process of exploring our questions while observing which ones are no longer worthy of our attention. So, those dead leaves we were talking about. And by connecting us with community and creating more structure around uncertainty, developing rituals like a questions practice can help us, kind of discern when to hold on to our questions and when to let them go. So the questions map is a tool to guide you through the practice. And today we're going to focus on the first step in the map in a moment. Before we do, I also want to share one of the big insights from my book to help you understand why building a questions practice can be so important. And that is that our relationship to the uncertainty in our lives directly reflects the relationship that we have to ourselves. And this means that forging a stronger relationship to ourselves can result in a better one with uncertainty. Questions can help us do that, acting as kind of an internal GPS to rediscover what we want, what we need, what's important to us, instead of clinging to what we think we should want or need according to the answers or expectations that other people might have. So we're going to take one of the questions that you had from the previous exercise and maybe the one that feels most urgent or challenging or kind of anxiety inducing to you. And we're going to take just a couple of minutes to start to work with that question and consider if it's actually the right question. What do I mean by that? What is the right question? So, the right question is one that is, first of all, going to feel expansive. It's going to open up possibilities rather than limiting them. So, that means we don't want a binary question. So, if you recall, when I was talking about my own examples earlier, one of the questions that I was asking was, should I get a divorce? And ultimately, what I learned is that that was the wrong question because it was a binary question. The answering that question, yes, didn't feel right for me because I didn't actually want to get a divorce. But answering no didn't feel right either because it didn't acknowledge the real problems at the heart of our relationship. So I ended up changing my question to something like, how might I need to change and how might my partner need to change in order for us to stay together? And so I would encourage you first to look at your question and see, is it a binary question? And if not, is there a way that I can kind of break it out, make it more expansive so that there's a broader swath of kind of possible futures, possible solutions in there for me? The second piece of, the kind of second filter that you can give to your question is whether it's serving as an internal GPS. Is it leading you back to something that you want, that's important to you, that your values? Sometimes we end up asking questions that other people are kind of asking us, putting pressure on us to answer, when in reality, we don't really want to answer that question, or it's not even, the question that we created for ourselves. So thinking about that too. The final piece of this is the question moving you forward versus is it keeping you stuck in the past? And this is another way of getting at that question of dead leaves, right? Is it kind of keeping you stuck in that cycle of regret and rumination, or is it helping you kind of see into the future? So one other quick example of this, in product management, we talk a lot about avoiding kind of finding solutions too early. And so one example might be if your question is, how do we build an AI chatbot, right? That essentially is kind of a solution trapped in a question. And so you might think about a more expansive, forward-moving question as what friction are users experiencing during onboarding and how can we alleviate that? So again, you can use an example from your personal life, from your professional life, or both, but we can take just 2 minutes now to kind of think about reframing that question. Hmm. And loving the questions that I'm seeing in the chat. So thank you again for sharing it. And I'm happy to share the map as a kind of follow-up. It is also in the book too, but I can share a PDF, Claire, with you and the team for sending a little bit later. But I will say the map right now, the questions that we are covering are the ones in the text on the screen. So the kind of first part of the prompt. So the rest of the map, we're not going to tackle that right now. We're going to just focus on is it the right question? But I will send a follow-up of the map.
Elizabeth, is there a retailer or a specific place where you prefer us to purchase your book?
You know, really, I can skip ahead to if folks want. This is, I think, goes to Amazon.
Okay,
So if you want to grab a copy there, but I know it's at pretty much anywhere books are sold. So it's at a lot of Barnes and Nobles. I know at some independent bookstores. If your bookstore doesn't have it, you can request it, and that's always great. Bookshop as well carries it. So anywhere you prefer, but yes.
great. Thanks for letting me interrupt with that because we are getting a lot of questions about some of the visuals that you're showing. So yeah,
Totally,
I think there's
totally.
a
Yeah.
lot of interest in that.
Great.
Independent bookstores, yes.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll come back together. And before we get into some implementation intentions, because of course, wouldn't be applied behavioral science if we didn't have a little bit of at the end about how we're going to apply this to our lives. I am curious if anybody wants to share in the chat and know yes, there is an Audible version. There is a sorry, so there is an audiobook version of it as well. Um, if anybody wants to share in the chat, if you did end up reframing your question with these prompts, I would love to hear about that. But again, no pressure to do that. So I will just give folks a little bit of time to do that too. And feel free to, I think in the Q&A, we can also kind of share in that moment as well. Um, so the final piece here that I wanted to talk through is to take a few minutes to just consider how and whether you might create the ritual of a questions practice in your own life. Of course, we know from behavioral science that creating an implementation intention, that kind of if then plan, can be a really powerful way to commit to a new habit or routine. So I have a couple of ideas in here. One could be carving out regular time during the week or the month to really consider what are these big questions that are animating my life right now? Am I asking the right question? Um, and are you asking the question that will give you the widest set of possible futures and solutions and ideas? And the second is one that you can practice in a moment when you're feeling particularly anxious. And it comes from Judson Brewer's book, Unwinding Anxiety. He recommends learning to weave curiosity into our most stressful moments, asking questions like, how is this feeling serving me right now? And even a simple, when you feel anxiety can help bring you into the present moment, create that space for curiosity, and allow you to see what's happening from a new perspective and maybe create that space for asking a question. Um, so I will, let's see. The other thing that I can do is I can get the PDF of the map and I can just like share that for folks that just like want to see it a little bit clearer. So I'm happy to do that at the end as well. But just want to very briefly recap. We learned about how our brains are wired to prefer certainty. This preference doesn't always help us, especially in our modern world. In fact, it can cut us off from reaching better decisions, finding a greater swath of answers and possibilities. We learned about another strategy for relating to uncertainty. And that is forming a different relationship to our questions. And we got to know our questions a little bit better too, through some of the prompts that we went through together. So really appreciate all of you for being willing to explore your questions with me. And I'm very happy to take your questions, of course. So we can pause and maybe I'll stop while I can, let's see. I will also share too, if you are on Substack, I also have a Substack. So anybody that wants to follow along, my Substack is called Time Travel for Beginners, and it's all about exploring enduring, timeless questions that connect us like a time machine across different eras and different places in the world. So I will pause and hand it back to Claire, and we can go from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That blew me away. And based on the responses in the chat, I think a lot of people are very moved with this content. I had never thought about having a relationship with questions and uncertainty. I think I've learned to tolerate it, but not to like actually lean in and try and like love and have a relationship with the questions that I'm grappling with. So yeah, very, very expansive topic. So we have some questions in the questions doc. We have about six. I hope we can get through. We have 20 minutes left. So if you have questions, please put them in the doc. And something we like to do here is to actually call on you and ask you to come on camera and state your question because it's great to have like a face-to-face conversation. So for the first question here, Michael, if you are around, your question about opposing forces, Michael, if you could come off camera and ask your question, that would be great. Are you there? Okay, I'll read your question then. Okay, so the first question is, what are your views on the overwhelming opposing forces, such as the instant nature of digital and informational pathways, to discourage most people from more reflective and deep thinking? It feels like our brains are being retrained to be less patient for imbalance, not more.
Think that's spot on. I have a significant part of the book that's devoted to the impact of technology on our ability to um, be with our questions, to be with uncertainty. And I call some of these forces that you're talking about, especially some of the more let me just say like less benevolent forces, the charlatans of certainty. I think these are the kind of influencers that pop up that act like they have the answers to all of your deepest questions. If you'll just pay me X amount of money, I will give you all the answers, right? And so I think we can probably identify lots of these types of influences in our lives. Um, and my perspective on it is that, it has always been really hard for humans to tolerate uncertainty. And that is evidenced by just kind of millennia of work where people are kind of decrying this. But in a lot of ways, right now, we are living in a moment in which it is both harder to tolerate it because we do have so many kind of opportunities at our fingertips all the time, whether it's an AI assistant or just your smartphone being able to look things up, where we can get the answers that we seek. And so I think it is, it's not just your imagination, that it is really harder right now to develop this skill to actually cultivate patience. But my perspective on it is that this is one of the most important things to kind of reclaim agency in this moment where I think we give up so much of our attention and so much of our lives to our devices. Um, I think that there's a way that you can it's not. I certainly use my phone. I certainly use AI for questions that come up. I think one of the things that's really important and that I talk about in the book is that you really want to have an understanding. This is why the questions practice is really important of not only what question you're asking, but what is the right source for that question. So I think this is where we can get stuck and why technology and some of these influencers can be um, um, uh, can have a kind of detrimental impact because I think sometimes you have a question that comes up and instead of kind of thinking about it and getting curious about what is the right source for this question, is it me, is it someone else, we might immediately try to seek the answer from an outside source. And so this, that to me is part of the challenge, is being able to identify when a question is really something that only you can answer, right? Or maybe it's something that only you and your partner or your family can answer versus something that a podcaster is going to be able to tell you. So that's kind of, one piece of it. I think the other piece of it that I would say when it comes to technology and kind of that influence, those forces, is that a lot of times when we're dealing with uncertainty and questions, one of the big insights that I found from my interviews and research is that um, we think we want information. We think we want the answer in the form of, Gemini tells me what to do, right? But ultimately, sometimes in those moments when we're feeling most anxious, what we actually want is connection. Sometimes the questions that we're asking don't really have answers, right? And so ultimately, at the end of the day, you're probably going to feel a lot better if you join a community of people that are maybe in a similar place of uncertainty as you, or maybe you just call up a friend and you just talk to your friend about what you're dealing with. But a lot of the discomfort from uncertainty and that anxiety, sometimes it can just stem from feeling alone in what you're experiencing. So those are kind of some of the thoughts that come to mind, but there's a lot more on that too in the book.
I love that maybe the answer is not getting the answer, but finding community that will support you in that feeling of uncertainty.
Exactly.
Also makes me think of something we talk about with some of the projects we work on is introducing good friction. Like as product people, we're always trying to like remove friction, right? But sometimes we actually want to slow down. That is the better route.
Absolutely. I just wrote a Substack post actually about this, about the idea of bottlenecks. And, we talk about bottlenecks as being kind of the enemy of business and of velocity and all these things. And yet, what I wanted to do was actually understand, well, when, the bottleneck originally was an innovation, right? And what was it trying to do? And how do we understand bottlenecks through that lens of when the bottleneck actually was an innovative invention, and how does that kind of same thing apply to our lives today, and exactly what you said, the importance sometimes of friction, and not forgetting that.
Yeah, I love that. The bottleneck was actually an innovation and now it gets a bad rap.
Right,
So
exactly.
right. Okay, next question. Farhan, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Would you like to come on camera and or not on camera, but speak up and ask your question?
Absolutely. Hey Claire, hey Elizabeth, love to
Hey.
talk. My question is regarding again uncertainty, and I was curious if you notice this, does this come up in self-harm behavior as well? I ask this because what I notice at work and sometimes with my friends is that some sort of uncertainty comes up in negative behaviors like social media scrolling, doom scrolling, a little bit of um, substance abuse a little bit. I don't know much about studies on that, so I was wondering if you have some answers or thoughts on that.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So there's the short answer is that um, yes, there's definitely a relationship between tolerance of uncertainty and self-harm and addictive behaviors. A couple of the stories that I tell in the book are people who have grappled with addiction. And I think that, as you point out, sometimes those behaviors can be a way to cope with uncertainty, with questions in our lives. And that is what, some of the folks who I talked to shared with me, that this was some of the self-harm behaviors that they were engaging in were trying to fill a void for them, and that they had a lot of questions about their self-worth. They had a lot of questions stemming from, in many cases, childhood trauma, right? So trauma plays a significant role in how we grapple with uncertainty in our adult lives, and that's another big part of the book is looking at kind of the influence of trauma on our capacity to tolerate uncertainty. So I think you've hit it, you've nailed it, that it's definitely deeply intertwined.
Great. Thank you. Okay, next up, Leka, are you here to ask your question?
I'm here.
Sure, come
Leica,
on.
thank you so
Hi.
much.
Leka, thanks.
Um, this is really interesting, Elizabeth, so thanks for taking the time today. So, my question comes from kind of three places. One, I mean, generally the idea is uncertain, the embrace of uncertainty feels like a luxury. And
Mm,
that comes from well, three places. One, I remember going in the Met Museum and seeing, like, in antiquities time, the rich would be afforded be afforded to go to school and get an education. So embracing education, curiosity, and growth and learning were luxuries,
mhm.
whereas those who did not have the wealth were often laborers. The second came from I did work in intertemporal choice, so the idea of uncertainty also feels like you're able to see that you have time in order to embrace curiosity and questions. And third, in resource constricted environments, to embrace kind of to have the time to have questions means that you don't have to make the decision that could be costly to, I suppose, decision making. So if someone is facing a food, like if it's food choice, whatever it might be, but the decision is spending more money on something that thinking about health versus having to make that very fast choice of, oh, they have to live another day or they have to afford something more, so to stretch it out. So I think the question is, how does the work or the questions or the frameworks that you've brought up, how does it translate to non-weird settings and
Yeah.
wealth restricted environments where uncertainty can be costly to, like, life?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that is part of the reason that I have a chapter in the book devoted to people that are undergoing extreme uncertainty in their lives. So to your point, one of the stories that I tell is of a young man who's an undocumented immigrant in the US. And grew up in a very resource constrained environment. And in addition to that, grew up with the threat of being deported, his parents being deported for his whole life. And one of the things that he told me, because I also, like you, was skeptical. I was like, well, can this idea of loving the questions, does that really translate across different communities? And if so, kind of how and what does that look like? Um, and what he told me, and I think it's a little bit less maybe about some of the questions that you were sharing about, deciding what type of food to buy, which is a very important question, and a little bit more for him about some of these central questions about identity, some of these big questions about who he was, who he could be. And he told me that he grew up with a very narrow idea of who he was allowed to be in the world, who he could be. He grew up kind of in a society that was trying to put a label on him, right? Trying to put him in a box with this idea that he could only be valuable in our culture if he did X, Y, or Z things. And he describes this experience of joining a community of other undocumented immigrants and finding that they were asking totally different questions about who they could be, who they could become, pursuing totally different paths, occupations than he was. And the lesson that he took from that was that he that he could get more curious about who he could be, that he didn't have to close out the possibilities for his life. And so I think, while there isn't always going to be space in everybody's life to kind of sit with questions for a long time, I do think that many people crave that the ability to have a more expansive view of who they can be, right? And so I think that what he shared with me and what many others shared with me who had been in kind of extreme uncertainty, whether that be from that kind of like resource constrained or for other reasons. I also talked to folks who had different one woman who was paralyzed early in her life from the waist down, another man who had various mobility challenges. And so in all of these cases, what came back again and again was that kind of despite these circumstances, the desire, the craving to be able to actually have a broader and more expansive sense of who they were and who they could be in the world, which emerged from curiosity and emerged from kind of this practice. So I hope that helps answer your question, but I think it's a great question and something that I definitely try to address in the book as well.
That was a great question. Thank you. Okay, next up, Nadia, are you able to come and ask your question? Okay, I can read Nadia's question. How do we ask the right kind of questions that are positive and self-serving? Because negative questions like, am I good enough, can be self-harming. Where is the line between positive questions versus negative questions?
This is such a good one, and one that I have thought a lot about, in part because I think self-compassion is so deeply connected to this entire practice. I was talking a little bit about the importance of your relationship to yourself when it comes to forming a different relationship to uncertainty. And so I would think about, the line being, is the question that I'm asking, is it a compassionate question, right? Is it a question that I would ask a friend, that I would pose to a friend? Is it a question that is that feels supportive, that feels loving? And I think only you can answer that. But I think just asking yourself those questions is can be helpful when you're trying to unpeel the kind of inquiry. And I think that often, as you're pointing out, we ask questions that maybe even subconsciously, like, why am I such an idiot, right? Like, we just ask these questions, not even thinking about the impact that they're having on us. They're like, why didn't I get that right? Like, what's wrong with me? So these are the type of, questions that if we go back to that, those prompts too of, is it expansive, internal GPS moving you forward? First of all, those questions are failing on all counts. But if you think about that internal GPS, that's where you can really kind of root down in, is this question kind of leading me back to myself? Is it helping me feel a more compassionate relationship to myself? Or does it feel, antagonistic? And so I think those are the types of questions that I would ask. But I think you're totally right that the questions that we ask ourselves should feel compassionate, or else, we're not going to want to answer them, right? They're not going to feel good. We're not going to want to have a relationship to them. And that's kind of what it's about at the end of the day. How do you create a question that you actually want to carry with you, that you actually want to have a relationship with?
Yeah. That's great. Always be, yeah, questioning how can we reframe this question to be more self-compassionate. We have 2 minutes left. Elizabeth, would you be willing to take one more question?
Totally. I do
Okay.
have a hard stop at the hour, but I can
Okay.
absolutely try
All
to
right.
try my best.
Well, we will go fast. Oh, now we have 1 minute. So I will do a quick outro and then we'll ask the last question. So just a reminder to please, if this moved you, purchase Elizabeth's book, follow her on Substack. You can find Kristen Berman, Irrational Labs on Substack as well. And we will email the recording to you later this week or early next week. So final question is Mohammed. If we can do a quick, rapid fire Q&A, Mohammed, if you'd like to come on and ask your question, go ahead. All right, well, this is similar to the last one. What is the right balance of introspective within myself versus extrospective questions to solve a problem?
Hmm. Um, it's a great question, and I think it's one that sounds like it would be a great one to kind of work with on the questions map. A, but B, I think the kind of introspective, extrospective, to me, I think there are a few questions embedded in there. There's kind of, how much do you think you already have the answers, right? And so, really honestly asking yourself, how much of this do I already know? And then, B, is there a group, are there people who you genuinely think can be helpful, and that you genuinely want to understand and learn from? And so I think, there's part of what I hear in there is maybe there's a little bit of fear around trusting yourself, right? Like, do we, introspection and kind of finding the answers within you is, you have to trust in a certain sense that you have that capacity. And so that can be scary. So I think, I would encourage you to think about that as well, as like how much of that question is coming from a bit of fear, and kind of where is that fear coming from. But those are my, sorry, a little bit scrambled thoughts. I'm sorry that I have to run, but thank you so much, Claire, and
Yeah.
everybody at Irrational Labs, and Rosie and Lisa for having me. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. This was wonderful. Thank you all for being here today. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
Elizabeth. Bye.